Good morning, everyone who's just joined. We're waiting for a few minutes, a couple of minutes to let people to join, and then we'll kick off shortly. Phil, you've raised your hand. Do you want to put through a question?
No, I didn't raise my hand.
Sorry, it's Phil Smales from IMEX has raised his hand.
Sorry.
Let's go. Okay, I think we should probably start. We've got enough people on now. Just want to say, first thing before I say anything else, because otherwise Tala, our marketing manager, will kill me. We're recording this this morning. It's 27th of January 2021. We're just after 9 o'clock in the morning, and this is FairHeat's 6th anniversary event. And it's quite different this year to last year. Last year we were in Ricks in Westminster. We had slightly underestimated number of people would be coming along. So we had 130 attendees with 110 seats. So we had 20 people standing along the back there. And it was a slightly different atmosphere because we got to mix together and we had some coffee and biscuits first. And I think that's going to be a bit of a theme of today, is one around transformation and just the impact of what's been going on really over the last year. And on that front, I actually went back and looked at the headlines from a year ago and thought, well, it'd be interesting to just have a look at what was going on a year ago. And it was quite interesting. We had our first notification, sort of subtle in the news on the 23rd of January was the first time it really came up with COVID. And then Guardian headlines, 27th of January, actually it was only Guardian who really covered it in detail. There was the coronavirus, 100,000 may already be infected. And it's been a pretty difficult year for everyone. 100,000 is a resonant number, as we saw in the news today and yesterday. We've passed 100,000 dead in the UK. And I think when we were sitting here in Ricks a year ago, we really didn't have any concept of what the next year would hold for us, for all of us. And it's obviously impacted some of us much more than others. I'm aware that people on the call have lost other people. Some people on the call have been very close to losing their own lives. But today, I don't want to focus on the negatives. It's a birthday after all. It's our 6th birthday. I really want to focus on some of the positives, and I think we can focus on positives from the last year. Because when I think back to what's happened from a year ago and then what's happened over that time, and I was just going through, and the things that sort of came into mind, the way we shop, Amazon, Ocado, the way we interact with each other today. We're on Zoom, Microsoft Teams. I think I spend about 6 to 7 hours a day on Teams. We interact with people when we're doing workshops, Jamboard. Our kids, Class Dojo, Google Classroom, spend much too time. And even the way we sort of do exercise. I personally spend a lot of time on something called Swift. It's a virtual cycling interactive. I've got a little pain cave upstairs where I've got a hole between my boxes and I get on my bike and go cycling. I think the thing that's really stunning about all of this is when I think back to when I was working as a consultant, Boston Consulting Group, and a lot of things we used to look at, and the pace of time. I did some work looking at pay television and telephones and the penetration and uptake. The change we've seen over the last 12 months is a sort of change you see in a generation. We have totally changed the way we do everything, and we've done it in less than 12 months. And I think when we come to talk about heat networks and energy and housing and the sort of changes with regards to climate change we need to make, again, it's a similar sort of challenge. And I think the thing that's really positive is we've shown that we can do it. We've shown that if we have to, we really can make the sort of changes we need to make. So that's part of the theme for today. When I talk about FairHeat, because again, it is a birthday, if I can get, there we go. This was us a year ago. So we're in Borough Market. This is just under the arch near us. And we're all together. And it's been somewhat odd because over the last year, we've grown a lot. The sector has continued to grow a lot. The need for quality assurance within the sector has continued and it's grown at pace. And this is a product of our times, and I apologize because I put together this photo, but that's what we are now. We have grown significantly. We actually grew 50% in the last year. And so we now have a third of our employees, people who work at FairHeat, actually didn't work with FairHeat at the start of the lockdown. This group of people has actually never ever stood together. We haven't been able to. So we've brought in 8 people into the company and integrate them. I think one of the things that's been fascinating as part of that is actually it's been really effective. It's not been easy, but we've been able to integrate people. We've been able to use new tools. And you have to work at it, you have to do a lot of other things, but it's been really positive. And I think we've actually got a really even more cohesive group. And again, I want to come back to that. It's been a transformation. It's been a total change in the way we work. And for us, it's been a difficult time, but it's also been a really positive time in being able to bring really talented new people into the sector, which is what we need to continue to do. And I think this is a big decision we made last year. We said, do we pull up the drawbridge? Do we sort of hunker down? Or actually, there's some brilliant people out there. There's brilliant new graduates out. And actually, there's an opportunity to bring them in. So we made a decision, no, we can bring in 4 new graduates this year. We can continue bringing another 4. And we're going to also bring in people from other sectors into the sector to actually support us. So big growth over the last year. Today's program, as mentioned, 6th birthday. We thought, actually, no, we are going to do it. We are going to continue to use this format to get out. And really, it's an opportunity for us to showcase. We've been doing a lot of research. And there's been a lot going on in the industry. So session 1 is all about that change. It's all about how do we transition to low carbon heat? How do we go through that transformation? There's a lot coming through from a regulatory perspective. We're going to go into that, talk about that. We've got CP1 2020 has just come through. We've got a couple of big things on the horizon in the shape of regulation and customer protection within that, and also heat network assurance. So we're going to talk through that. Session 2, starting at 12 o'clock, is very much a technical showcase. It's going to go over a lot of the research we've been doing in collaboration with others. So we've got a lot of external speakers as well coming into that. We can talk about some things like domestic hot water, different approaches. And then the final session, again, really important, starting at 3:15, is about how we decarbonize heat networks. And that's taking 2 aspects. It's new build, how do we integrate, and predominantly around how do we get heat pumps into new build developments. And then the other piece is around how do we decarbonize, how do we retrofit, and then how do we decarbonize the existing schemes. And we've got BEIS there to talk around that, the HNU heat network opportunity, improvement opportunities, optimization opportunities, excuse me, program where we looked at 10 different heat networks and just taking some of the learnings from that. So I want to get on to session 1 because it's a great session now. It's all about how we transition to low carbon heat. We've got superstar lineup, and the format is we're going to have a series, 6 talks. So 6 10-minute talks. The first hour is going to be taken up by talks, and then we're going to have a panel discussion and really take that through and take some Q&A from you, from the audience. First up is Caroline Bragg, Head of Policy at the ADE, who's going to talk about regulation, direction of regulation for the industry and what the likely direction that's going to take. Shivali Mathur from Heat Network, who's a heat network specialist at BEIS, so Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We've then got Mariota Smutz, who joined us a few months ago, who's come in as Head of Policy and Assurance in FairHeat, who's going to be talking about assurance and the role that's like to play for heat networks. Phil Jones, I think most of you will know, independent consultant, who is the lead author of CP1 2020, who's going to be talking about CP1 2020, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. We've then got Tanya Groth, speaking to us from Denmark. She's director of SWECO, who did a lot of research, who did some research on skills gaps, going to talk about skills gap in the industry. We've got Noah Nkonge, who's going to come in to really talk about, he's head of partnerships at Vattenfall, who's going to talk through the industry response to this challenge, and particularly putting on a Vattenfall hat and what they're looking to do. So without further ado, I'm going to move on into the session. The other thing that I think was notable about 2020, other than the COVID and the impact, is we can't forget about the other big challenge we've got. 2020 was tied for the hottest year on record. The issue hasn't gone away. We had a minor sort of blip down in carbon emissions, obviously with lockdown across the world, but that's coming back with a vengeance. But again, it showed, I think the changes that we went through showed that we can make a difference. We can make a short-term difference, and we have to make changes. And I think that's really clearly illustrated here. When we're talking about heat networks, and fundamentally this is about heat, but it's also about heat networks, I think within the context of that change we need to make, and climate change and decarbonisation, heat networks are a demonstrated model for reducing carbon from heat. I know a lot of people have seen this before. What we've got on the left is heat supply to Swedish domestic district heating systems between 1969 and 2015 by heat source. And what we saw is a significant growth over a 40-year period there of supply from district heating. But at the same time, over on the right, we've got the CO2 per megajoule of heat delivered. And during the early period, it was quite heavy in terms of carbon intensity, but then we've seen pretty much an almost total decarbonisation of heat over that period, particularly between the period of sort of 1980s through to 2000, start of 2005, if you like, where we've got that really big change. But the big change between sort of 1980 through to 1994, if you like, so that sort of 15-year period, we saw a really big drop off. I think that's the key lesson we've got here, is heat networks are a really good model for decarbonising from heat. And that's been recognised. And that's why that's become a model that's being put forward. All the 3 different strategies that we've got from the Energy White Paper have a base case for heat networks. And heat networks are an attractive model for the UK. Particular reasons: it's technology agnostic and it's permissive, so you can have multiple generations of technologies, and that's what we saw in Sweden, where we had one technology then being substituted out for others. We saw thousands of megawatts of heat pumps come in the 1990s and substitute out coal. So it's great from a transitionary technology perspective. It also allows interaction, managed interaction between power and heat, and that's what we're seeing a lot of in Denmark now, that when power prices drop, you can have heat coming in, and the real use of storage within that. Really importantly, we know it actually works. It's not a technology where we have to have big changes or be counting on future change. It's not CCS, it's not hydrogen. We actually have case studies of this working on large scale. Other technologies may well work, but here we have a technology that we know works. And we're also a really long way down the experience curve. We've been investing into this really since early 2000. We've had a couple of waves, but if we take the changes with back in 2006, Code for Sustainable Homes, we had a lot of resurgence. So we've got the last really 15 years, we've been looking into heat networks. And I think we're a long way down the experience curve, but it is a big challenge. The numbers we talk around as a sort of a base level are 20% that we need to get to. I personally think that we shouldn't be stopping it for 20%. There's a lot of evidence we could go to 40% or even 60% if we look at the density of housing in the UK, density of heat, and look at other models across Europe. But if we just start at 20%, it's a massive challenge. And I'm going to do really back of envelope figures here, and I know all the engineers in the audience will shoot it down, but bear with me, we're talking about order of magnitudes here. If you just take your domestic fuel boiler capacity in the UK, 25 kilowatt average boiler size, we've got 24 million homes. That equates to about 600,000 megawatts of boiler capacity that we have to transition away over the next, let's say, 25 years. And if heat networks had been 20% of that, and I think that really is the baseline of what we should be aiming for, over a 25-year period, it's about 120,000 megawatts of boilers to transition away from, which is about 100 megawatts of boilers per week, or about 500 kilowatts of boiler per hour. Again, really, really rough numbers here. Just putting that in context, what that means is we have to have really huge continuous growth sustained over a 25-year period while decarbonising. So on the left, the photo there, I took this from the NG website. King's Yard is seen as one of the real flagship heat network developments in the UK, Olympic Park. This is the King's Yard energy centre on it. From the website, 45 megawatts of heat. So we have to, in terms of transitioning away of capacity, that equates to about 2 times this capacity every week. We need to do it on a zero or low carbon basis. Or on the right, we've got Queen's Quay up in Glasgow, beautiful development there at the top, energy development, taken from Star Renewables website. You've got the twins down bottom. We've got 2 water source heat pumps, 2.6 megawatts. Again, a fantastic flagship development. We need to be getting up to doing 2 of these every day. So that's again getting to 20% market share. That effectively implies a 11% cumulative annual growth rate every year, 25 years. Again, I don't think we should be saying this as a, oh my God, that's too hard to do. It's a, oh my God, what an opportunity. And I think we do have a huge opportunity. And I think what we've seen over the last year is we can transform ourselves. We can transform, but it does mean that we have to tackle every single aspect of the industry, and we have to change every aspect. So we're going to now run through different speeches. So we've got regulatory changes. Caroline's going to go through that before we get into customer protection from Shivali. Assurance, Mariota's going to go through that. CP1 2020 from Phil Jones. Then we talk about skills gap with Tanya, and then how the industry is going to respond from Noah, followed up by a panel discussion. So first up is Caroline Bragg, who's head of policy at the ADE. Caroline, do you want to come in?
Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Gareth. So as Gareth was saying, I'm going to give a quick overview this morning about the regulation and the policy that we can see coming forward in the next few years, and then where we might go after that, and its impact on heat networks, and more particularly the ability to decarbonise. Firstly, I think it's important when we consider this, just building on what Gareth has said, to consider the challenge that we have, and particularly on the customer side. Obviously, as many people talk about, we have made quite significant strides in terms of power decarbonisation over the last 30 years or so, but that has not been replicated yet in building sector emissions, and they remain roughly actually where they have been since the 1990s. On top of that, I think it's also important, oh gosh, sorry about that. I think it's also important to bear in mind that awareness of the challenge of heat decarbonisation is actually relatively low amongst the public. So last year we saw, 2 years ago now, only 49% understood that gas central heating was a source of carbon emissions, and less than 20% had considered switching to low carbon heating. You can also see that type of awareness replicated in people's understanding of heat networks in the UK. So, coming to that context, what are we going to see thrown into the mix in terms of policy and regulation in the next few years? What I'd like to do this morning is take you through, I think, 3 key themes that we need to think about. So that is policy and regulation that is specifically targeting the heat network market and what that might mean. Secondly, looking at broader questions of heat decarbonisation, where policy and regulation might go, and what that will mean in terms of its impact on the heat network sector. And then finally, I also wanted to add a few comments about future policy and regulation towards deep electricity decarbonisation. So, to start with, let's talk heat network regulation. As Gareth said, there is an enormous amount of policy and regulation that is coming forward this year and in the next few years. Obviously, what we have seen is local planning pressure towards decarbonisation continuing to grow, and I think we will continue to see that going forwards, particularly when you consider the local authorities that have declared climate change emergencies and the steps that they might take to achieve that. Clearly as well, only last week, we had new building regulations in the form of the Future Home Standard, which will also drive particularly decarbonisation in new buildings. The other things that we see coming forward will have a very significant impact on heat networks too. This year, we have new metering and billing requirements, and then from 2022, we will have a general authorisation and licensing regime for the heat network market that will include likely customer standards and redress mechanisms, technical standards for both new and existing heat networks, emission limits or some form of emission standards for heat networks, and for those who opt for the licensing regime, new powers in the form of statutory undertaker rights. Beyond this, and in parallel, what we are also going to see is new funding schemes in the form of the Green Heat Networks Fund from 2022, and also possibly the introduction of heat network zones that will give new rights and powers and incentives to connect to heat networks in particular areas. I think reflecting on this enormous amount of policy and regulatory activity in the next few years, there's a couple of questions that really stand out in terms of what this means for heat networks and what it means for their decarbonisation. I think firstly, this mix of policy and regulation needs to achieve quite a difficult balance actually between driving up standards, supporting customer outcomes, as well as ensuring that heat networks truly build their competitiveness and can incentivize connections from both new and existing buildings. And it needs to achieve that balance across the breadth of this sector, from the smallest heat networks right up to the largest citywide schemes. I think the other really important thing that this policy activity raises is that we need to make sure that this combination of policy, of new standards, of regulation, as well as some support, can create the conditions so that it is preferable, particularly for existing buildings, to connect to a heat network rather than a normal gas boiler refurbishment. Which leads me to the bigger question around what is going on with heat decarbonisation and where we might be in the next few years. I think in terms of looking at where government is going and what we might see, there are a couple of things that really stand out. I think in the heat and building strategy, in the net zero cost review and the net zero strategy, all of which are slated to be published this year, what we are hoping to see is a much stronger strategic vision from government for the relative contributions of different heat decarbonisation pathways and the decisions and actions that we need from government in order to support those pathways and their growth. The other really important thing for this discussion is the question around the relative costs of decarbonisation, and particularly between electricity and gas with respect to network costs, policy costs, and carbon taxation. And I hope that we'll start to see more coming out from government on this question over the next kind of 6 to 12 months. The other important thing I think to bear in mind when we talk about this is that there is also going to be a number of subsidy support schemes being put in place in the next few years to support these pathways. We can see it in the Clean Heat Grant from 2022 to 2025 to support heat pumps. There is also very likely to be new subsidy support coming forward for blue hydrogen and CCUS, as well as green hydrogen. And we already see new subsidy support schemes coming in for biomethane injection. I think reflecting on what this means for heat networks and what it means for their decarbonisation raises again a number of really important questions. Firstly, I think at the most political, the most strategic level, this is a really crowded field at the minute, with a lot of different visions for the future jostling for political and ministerial attention. I think it's really important for us and for the heat network sector more broadly that we are firmly establishing ourselves and continue to maintain our place at that table. I think secondly, there is still a lot to be won and a lot of opportunities, but also some risks in terms of how the shape and the detail of all of this regulation and policy that will come forward will reflect on its impact on the heat network market and how far it will support heat network decarbonisation. Finally, I think that raises some really quite big questions about the future of energy infrastructure in this country and how we pay for it. Over the next few decades, it's clear that I think the most likely outcome is we will see a really quite significant expansion of the electricity networks. We may well see new infrastructure being put in place for hydrogen, as well as the repurposing of the gas networks. And we will have new heat network infrastructure at the same time as potentially a shrinking of the existing gas network infrastructure in some places. And all of that needs to be funded and supported. I think the question of how we do that in a way that is equitable and is effective at incentivizing the right choice, the right infrastructure in the right place is something that is still very much an open question. And then finally, I just wanted to say a couple of things in terms of where electricity policy and strategy might go over the next few years and what it might mean for heat networks. I think for the purposes of our discussion today, the two really big questions are firstly, what the government will say over the next 10 years about how it will secure enough and the right types of capacity for a decarbonised electricity system. I think then secondly, there is an enormous piece of work to be done about increasing flexibility across the system over the next 10, 20 years. That comes from both on a national level in terms of the ability of the system operator to access and to source flexibility from smaller distributed assets. And it also brings into view the role of the distribution network operators, their likely potential transition to a distribution system operator, and an enormous uptake in their procurement of flexibility services. For heat networks and for their decarbonisation, I think that raises a number of specific questions. I think firstly, if we think that the vision of the future on the electricity system is for much more volatile pricing, real value and revenue to be had from being flexible, that raised the question firstly on the importance of making sure that heat networks can respond to that, making sure that we're not putting in place business models design that frustrate the ability to kind of respond to that, to make money out of these new markets, but also a real potential to really integrate these systems together, to provide real system benefits on both the heat and the electricity side from the flexibility that we have within heat networks. So that's a very quick run through, but I'm sure we'll get into a really good discussion in the next little bit. Thank you so much. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. Now, if I could pass over to Shivali Mathur from BEIS. Shivali, are you?
Yeah, Gareth.
Are you?
Thank you. Thanks, Gareth. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining early morning today. My name is Shivali and work in the Heat Networks Department at BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I would echo, as Gareth said, that let's see some positives while we celebrate FairHeat's 6th birthday. I'm trying to move this. It was working a little, yeah, that's it. And following some positive announcements, one from Prime Minister on the 10-point plan, which highlighted the importance of the role of green finance in the green industrial revolution. And second, the Chancellor announcing the spending review announcements, in which I would say it's a very challenging economic time for the country. But pleased to say that heat networks were mentioned in the announcing of £122 million of capital in 21-22. Last year, we were the first country to legislate and commit to net zero emissions by 2050. And I would say, I know Caroline's gone through some numbers from past, but just to see another positive impact aspect of it as well, that we have seen significant levels of progress since 1990 levels. In 2017, UK actually returned to energy-related emissions to those of 1888. And I would say that's a big achievement. We have, I think, made a really good progress in decarbonizing electricity. It's widely recognized now that decarbonization of heat is the next big challenge. Also transportation and industry, in fact. In our clean growth strategy, and also, as Gareth mentioned about the energy white paper, we have identified a few different pathways on heating the buildings. And in all of them, I would say heat networks play a key role. So these pathways are typically thought of the low carbon gas, hydrogen, green gas injected to the grid, or electrification pathways, such as the big heat pumps, electric heaters, hybrids. And as you all know, and reinforcing again what Caroline and Gareth said, heat networks are technology agnostic, which is what makes them so versatile. And we see them playing out a role in all the pathways, all the scenarios of electrification or hydrogen, and improving the effectiveness. One thing I would say, that a position which has been consistent for the last 8 years in terms of our forecasting for long term, that heat networks will play a key vital role. That's absolutely a key part of the future energy system. Oh, did I miss a couple of things? Sorry, I'm just trying to get through the IT bit. Yeah. Sorry, Gareth.
Do you want me to click through?
Is a slide, can I go on to slide 3, please? If that's okay. Yeah, the one before this, please. Putting into perspective, today we have around 14,000 heat networks. Thanks, Gareth. Out of which 2,000 are district heating, serving around 500,000 customers. Largely gas-fired CHPs with peaking boilers. And right now, we have heat networks supplying around 2% of the UK's heat demand. But in 2050, the Committee on Climate Change estimates this could be as much as 18%. Personally, I agree with Gareth. As he said, it should be above 20%. but I like to put it more into the terawatt hours perspective. So thinking about terawatt hours, that's probably somewhere around 80 to 90 terawatt hours of heat delivered from district heat network at that time of 2050, which is a sizable chunk. And these numbers are driven by Committee on Climate Change and what they consider to be our most effective pathways to reach our carbon targets. So why do we like heat networks then so much? They do not save carbon on their own, but what they enable us is to unlock some of the really exciting large-scale carbon source of heat that's available right away across the country, whether it's waste heat from industries or heat coming from the energy from waste plants, mine workings. I think some of you must have seen Coal Authority publishing the heat maps recently, also from rivers, along the other host of sources. Because of the greater efficiencies, the improved performance, the ability to trade on the system, I think Caroline mentioned about the role of flexibility and the role of ESOs and DNOs in this, and the ability of heat networks to store energy, to respond to the wider system. What we are doing is enabling a much more effective use of energy in meeting that demand. Now, really quickly, because I want to move to market framework bits, I'll whiz past through the UK government support, our support available on heat networks. In addition to our own team support, the government now backs the heat networks with more than £500 million, giving a strong signal of support there, namely with our flagship capital support program, the HNIP, so Heat Networks Investment Program, with £320 million, which provides commercial and construction funding. Recently announced the £270 million Green Heat Network Fund, which is targeted to decarbonize new and existing heat networks. We're proposing a green gas levy on gas suppliers to support fund green gas injection to our gas grid. As government, we have been supporting since, I think, 2013, lots of local authorities, and proud to say that we have supported over 250 unique projects across 150 local authorities, from master planning to feasibility to detailed studies, with around investment of £23 million. The most exciting bit for this part of my presentation, which is consumer protection, is the next two categories, I would say. We are committed to developing a long-term market framework for the sector with the sole reason, with the heart of the heat network, which is consumer, enhancing the consumer protection, set out the standards, encourage the low carbon solutions, and promote investment. I think striking the balance between, for consumers and investors, getting the price right through the framework. The framework, our consultation closed in June last year, and thank you for the industry for putting your responses in. In addition to the city decarbonisation agenda, we have heard what industry has asked for and believe that heat network zones will have a big role to play in the expansion of heat networks. We will consult on the proposals in spring, which actually looks to knit together a coherent narrative for heat networks across the 2020s and moving forward. Thinking about coming in 2025 and starting to address that equation which we have in heat networks of risk-return equation. Zoning could look to address the connection risk, which was, I think, touched base by Caroline quite nicely. Move to the next slide. Yeah, can we move to the next slide? And the other one. I think I'll have to run through a few of them very quickly. Really quickly on the numbers from HNIP, we've spent around £125 million on the projects in the first 6 rounds, and I've been told recently that already the number has gone up in January. Some of the projects you've heard would be the use of abandoned heat from in Gateshead, from Mine Water, and also Cardiff, and then there are a few others. Let's go on our slide 7. So I'll briefly mention about the Green Heat Network Fund, which will help to build the momentum on previous projects. I think these slides are going to be circulated, so it's there to read. But just to mention one line about Green Heat Network Fund is it will ensure that there is limited to no funding gap for heat networks. So the sector is supported well, and especially towards our low carbon heat production. and use of low carbon technologies. Moving on to more important bit of the market framework, very pleased to say that when CMA, the Competition Market Authority, they published their response to ensuring the sustained investment in protecting consumers in December, a couple of years now, 3 years back, they recommended giving heat network consumers equivalent or similar protections to those in the gas and electric sectors. The consumer protection measures to be included in the general conditions that suppliers or operators will need to make under a general authorization regime. They've proposed the consumer protection measures should apply to domestic consumers, to micro businesses and others, reporting that requirements to be tailored to scheme size. So a lot was actually highlighted at that time and recommended. The letter went to the ministers in April 2019. Again, I would once again thank the industry for coming back with the responses last year when the consultations for market framework and metering and billing regulations was out. The market framework consultation closed in June 2020. And now the big circle in yellow is what our policy teams are working day and night, I would say, to drive the legislation and towards establishing the regulator. Why the market framework? And when we say market framework internally as well, the 3 big pillars which come to our mind is supporting the market, consumer protection, and decarbonization. These are the 3 underlying principles of this framework. The suppliers are encouraged to work towards their quality of service ahead of the regulation, I would say. Join the Heat Trust, the industry-led voluntary consumer protection scheme. A lot of work was done last year during COVID time as well, and I would say this, it was very nice to see in this pandemic situation as well, the sector to come along together and sign the consumer protection. Further work has also happened with Heat Network Exchange and emergency responders, which will be touch-based later on in the afternoon session. Moving on a little bit on, we've moved 2 slides. Sorry, I think we both are doing it, Gareth. Yeah. So the main, from a market framework perspective, the 3 key things, as I said, were what our pillars is decarbonization, consumer protection, and supporting the market. But what are the underlying principles for consumer protection? Transparency, the requirement to develop the information packs containing the minimum pre-contractual information, requirements on the provision of heat supply agreements, the minimum standards on billing, back billing, billing frequency. All these would help protect the consumers, make it more transparent. Second big thing, pricing. Powers were regulated to investigate whether prices appeared to be disproportionately high or mandatory price transparencies. All these things are being worked at as we speak. Quality of service. One of the important things in discussion is also the statutory access to independent redress, like energy ombudsman. Sorry, I need to quickly move to the next slide, Gareth, please.
This one?
Yeah.
That one?
And
Yeah.
the next one.
This one?
Yeah. This one. Yes, please. Thank you. Sorry about the citation. Supporting the market growth and investment. Again, we've highlighted, I would say I'll highlighted that it is utmost important to build the heat network's reputation and regulatory certainty. And how? By introducing the regulatory framework equivalent to other critical infrastructure markets. Again, as CMA said, that equivalent to gas and electricity markets, driving up the performance of not so well performing networks and the outcomes for consumers, reducing the development burdens and risks. I think that's a big one, and I've heard a lot from the industry on the consultation as well. Introducing the statutory rights and powers equivalent to other utilities. What sort of powers would that be? So I'll just go a little bit into this because it's quite important. So that could specifically be permitted developments, classifying certain aspects of heat network development as not requiring planning permission, maybe. Easements, granting licensed rights entities the rights to apply for the right to purchase access rights over land. Street works, ensuring that heat networks can carry out the street works on the same permit system as other utilities. Consultation rights, commit to improve guidance on what heat network projects should be consulted about the developments that could affect them. There are linear obstacle rights, granting the licensed entities equivalent rights to cross the linear obstacles such as railway lines, tramways, canals. So lots behind these four focal points as well. Important again to support the heat networks as local solution. We've mentioned zoning a few times, and I'm sure it's going to come up in our discussion later from participants as well. Next slide, please. Gareth, thanks. Really quickly, because I'm mindful that yes, we are running over time, which is what I thought I'll get told off soon. But literally 30 seconds on this to go through an indicative regulatory structure in a visual way for everyone to understand the big picture. I would say from BEIS perspective, from the government, we are responsible for introducing the primary legislation, appointing the regulator, the grant easements, some of it which we touched a little while ago, set the decarbonisation target, provide the guidance and support to local authorities regarding the zones, regarding the concessions. And then we've got OPSS, the Office for Product Safety and Standards, who are already currently monitoring and enforcing the metering and billing regulations. Local authorities, very key as well. Part stakeholders develop the local approaches to decarbonisation. They may use the zoning arrangements as well. I mentioned before about energy ombudsman to handle the individual complaints. Again, consumer protection at the heart of the framework. Now, the regulator authorizing the schemes, setting the quality of service standards, again monitoring pricing, transparency, ensuring the regulated entities demonstrate the compliance and enforce the powers to compel the compliance. So that's to put into perspective. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Shivali. Thank you for that. We're now going to move on, following on from Shivali's presentation and talking about the different protection mechanisms that can be put in place, to Mariota Smutz talking about assurance.
Thanks, Gareth. Hopefully I can jump on and take over.
Just tell me to pass through it in the meantime.
Oh, okay. Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Mariota Smutz, Head of Policy and Assurance for FairHeat. Today, I'm going to discuss the role and importance of assurance and as we transition to low carbon heat. As Gareth mentioned, I've joined FairHeat a couple of months ago after nearly 20 years working in policy and regulation in New Zealand across a variety of portfolios: transport, electricity, medicines, public health, and urban development. Often within a position working with innovation and finding that sweet spot of flexing regulation and enabling growth. It's an incredibly interesting time to be in the UK and working within the heat sector. There's so much need for flex and change. And as Gareth and Caroline and Shivali mentioned earlier, there's an enormous amount of regulatory activity on the way. Lots of questions to ask and lots of questions to answer as well. So some of the messages I'll share are not new, but they're an important part of our roadmap as we transition. Sorry, we'll go to the next slide. Achieving our net zero 2050 goals, virtually all carbon emissions from heat and buildings will need to be eliminated, and creates a significant coordination and delivery challenge for many sectors. Heating of buildings across the UK contributes to over a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And as you've heard already, it's the heat networks that will be instrumental in meeting our decarbonising ambitions because of their unique ability to use low or zero carbon energy sources. Logically, we need to accelerate the growth of this market. But how do we upgrade our supply chains, increase manufacturing, ramp up our skills and training, and provide certainty and gain confidence of investors? How do we deliver on our goals? These are issues we need to navigate really, really quickly. In order to accelerate growth, government estimates that up to £16 billion of capital investment is required from public and private investment. However, the UK's heat network market is immature compared to European countries, and therefore has not been able to organically grow and establish those quality practices over a time frame. Thinking back to Gareth's slide of decarbonisation in Sweden, we don't have 40 years to create our new norms, our stable growth for supply chains, materials, skills, and the labour market dynamics. We don't have that luxury of time to allow for organic growth. So how can we grow if there are significant quality issues to address? Our current market insights include that there is inconsistency in design and delivery of heat networks, There's a fractured nature of our market, and there's a lack of clarity of roles and responsibility, all leading to poor performance and poor outcomes on some schemes. If left as is, this risks damaging the reputation of the industry and failing to attract that much needed public and private investment. Next slide. Often we tend to look at these issues through the energy and climate change lens only. However, heat networks exist in that neat space across other regulatory regimes too. So urban development, planning and land use, quality safe buildings that meet our needs of how we live, work, study and play today and in the future are all mechanisms that are also in flux. As mentioned earlier, we've been upended through our experience with COVID-19. So how we build and where we build and the quality of our homes, creates an expectation of our service levels. And that expectation, of course, is through to our utilities that'll play a key factor. And no doubt, our panel members will turn their minds to later on. Creating quality heat networks are at the center of these, different regulatory decision-making frameworks. And it's important we can navigate all of them to help this market grow. Next slide, please. Within the context and horrific circumstances in Grenfell, many factors came together to produce a terrible tragedy, which could sadly have been avoided. Although in the context of building safety, these systematic issues identified here can be extended across to heat networks. Key issues identified by Dame Judith Hackett's report. There's a culture of indifference that perpetuates issues such as roles and responsibilities of those procuring, designing and constructing and maintaining buildings are unclear. The package of regulations and guidance in the form of approved documents can be ambiguous and inconsistent. The process that drives compliance with building safety requirements are weak and complex, with poor record keeping and change control. In too many cases, competence across the system is patchy, and the product testing, labeling and marketing regime is opaque and insufficient. And most importantly, the voices of residents often goes unheard, even when safety issues are identified. We need a cultural shift away from this indifference to a culture of high performance. We can't grow a heat network market with confidence if we don't learn from this particular event. And it's really important that we get this, that this type of systemic trend is absolutely applicable through to the heat network area. Creating a transformational cultural shift and sector-wide behavioral change is hard, and people and industries are comfortable at being comfortable. So to get to where we need to go, certification to industry specifications will provide a catalyst for real and significant change. The transition journey must begin with getting it right up front, as we don't have 40 years to allow for organic growth. We need to de-risk these projects by ensuring the design, construction and commissioning of new heat networks perform well, and existing heat networks perform absolutely well as well from the start, and equally reducing overall life costs. Consistent application of high quality standards through CP1 2020 and FairHeat experience is already underway. Our ambition for a heat network assurance scheme is to lead by example, keep customers at the heart of our decision making, and because if we certify high performing heat networks, we'll see a better experience for end customers and residents. And it can't be a rubber stamping exercise. Again, we need to avoid poor scenarios like Grenfell. Next slide, please. In many ways, innovation and change is not new. We've already begun, the journey for new norms and a new status quo in many different sectors. Home building, electric vehicles, they've really pushed, what customers want and their customer experience. And quality assurance and verification plays a real key role in enabling the market to operate well. So for instance, you've got financial fintech industries working closely with regulators in a sandbox. They continue to develop more products, enabling market forces to drive more consumer choice. It's really, really important. Often seen within the health and medical devices, there's a significant amount of flex required to deliver consistently. And we've seen this work, but we've also seen it fail miserably. And so there's still a work in progress here. Next slide, please. We're already starting to see high performance. And this doesn't happen by accident. This high performance is designed and engineered. The graph on the left represents performance we're seeing with an example from last week on one of the projects. with consistent low temperature flows and return rates, coupled with a fantastic quote from Claire Taylor. Since the scheme opened, the heating system has been fabulous. Residents regularly tell me that they've never had such low heating bills. It's a wonderful system for ensuring well-being of our residents. And that's Claire Taylor from the Guinness Partnership. Again, if we get a heat network performing well, end customers benefit significantly. Next slide, please. The Heat Network Assurance Scheme will assess conformity to CP1 2020, and this will be the lead for a cultural shift, lifting performance and operating as a key feedback mechanism to the industry as it grows. This in turn will unlock the market further and reduce uncertainty for investors. And we see assurance as being particularly important in this early phase as market stimulation is occurring. It's an essential ingredient to build confidence. Next slide, please. We've identified some key stakeholder benefits for assurance. From the resident end user, increased reliability, less likelihood of overheating and network interruptions, increased comfort, affordability, so it can contribute to reducing fuel poverty, improved experience when all of these above are in place. From the developer, there's value for money, leveling the playing field, ensuring practices are consistent across projects, and increased transparency of costs, reduce risks, clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, and increased integrity of integrated planning. Skills transfer and verification to ISO standards, important feature of our heat network assurance scheme to provide high level of confidence across the industry. From an operator, clear delineation of roles and liability, less planned and unplanned outages, and reduced ongoing costs and maintenance. For the owner investor, again, so, increased confidence in the market and de-risking the project. Just a note here too, the government is a cornerstone investor and will want value for money. The regulator, HNAS will give confidence to the regulator as it's likely to get intended outcomes, such as decarbonisation of heat networks. That assurance itself will be fantastic to help the market grow. Finally, our key takeaways. Decarbonisation and a well-performing quality heat network matter. We should be aiming to grow the market more than just 20%, and to be quite optimistic, we should aim for 60%. We're on a journey to lift performance, and heat network assurance schemes will be the catalyst to change. And we know change is hard. We need to find our new norm sooner rather than later. We don't have the luxury of 40 years to get it right. And we need to get it right from the start, taking in all the lessons we can from other sectors. I suppose the key message here, though, is if you're contemplating a new project, we strongly encourage you to start thinking about assurance now, as regulations for certification assurance will be brought in from 2022. Assurance and certification will be lifting performance, not just on your project, but also facilitating that important cultural shift for the industry in adopting new norms and practices, therefore accelerating growth and providing a real and tangible step towards our goals for 2050. Thank you. Hopefully I'm within time.
Thanks a lot for that, Mariota. That was great. We're now going to move on to Phil, and I think that's a really natural step on. Seem to have lost. Natural step on. Got Phil Jones, who's going to talk through CP1 2020.
It says you've stopped my video, Gareth. I don't blame you, but here we go. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can get to my slides in a moment, Gareth, but I'll take this opportunity to say happy birthday, FairHeat. You grow year by year. Well done. But where's my cake? I'm Phil Jones. I've been 40 years spent 40 years trying to decarbonise buildings. The last 25 have been around heat networks. The last 5 have been around large-scale heat pumps on heat networks. And I've done lots of feasibility work across the UK on heat networks. So I am the lead author on CP1, and I think I was with you in RICS last year, promising that CP1 would come out. There were some significant delays, but it's out. Hooray, at last. So there have been some very big changes, and I wanted to give you a flavour of them. Next slide, please, Gareth. So officially called CP1 2020 to differentiate from the 2015 version. It's a massive update. And one of the things we recognized is just how important the client briefing is. It sounds obvious, but I don't think we had enough emphasis in the 2015 version. And so we've now got the client briefing right at the heart of this whole process. And it is a process now, not just a series of technical minimum requirements. This will greatly improve procurement of heat networks, specification of heat networks, and the whole process from one end to the other. These are very long projects and complex projects, and we need to get them right from the start. But it's also, the 2020 version has got much clearer roles, responsibilities throughout the whole project. There's a greater emphasis on compliance, and not just compliance at the end. There is little point in checking that it sort of maybe not works at operation. You've got to check it at every stage. And we now have a process within CP1 to check at every stage that client's brief is being met. Next slide, please. As part of that, we also have running right throughout the whole process and document performance metrics. And these are in the checklist that I'll talk about a little later, but these performance metrics are, again, set by the client and his team at the beginning, and then you check at the end of feasibility that you're still meeting them. You check at the end of a design that you're still meeting them, and so on and so forth. And they're fairly wide ranging, and the client can add to these, but we've put in economic viability, reliability, efficiency, heat losses, environmental aspects. Next slide, please. So this is, as I keep saying, a huge update from 92 pages to 240 pages. I did suggest to Gareth that I'd just sit here and read it all out, but he wouldn't let me. 540 minimum requirements now, 110 best practices. So it has grown very considerably, both in width and depth and clarity. It is a much clearer document, I think. It is still a voluntary code of practice, but it is a code of practice, not a guide. It sets minimum requirements. If the client says, I'm going to do CP1 2020, then you've got to follow it. There are elements that you can actually drop out, but you've got to put forward clear justification as to why you might do that. Lots of improved definitions as to what is district, what is communal, and also around the primary, secondary, and tertiary bits of the system, their heat losses. And we've started to set clear minimum requirements. Actually, it's a maximum, but it's a minimum requirement within the document, if you know what I mean, around heat losses. And what was one of the big problems that we've had over the last 5 years? Absolutely, the secondary heat losses, hot corridors. And so we're setting performance measures and maxima around that. Next slide, please, Gareth. We've also worked very hard on diversity, and huge thanks to my co-author Paul Woods for his very hard work on this. We are now focusing just on DS439, Danish standard. We've now, thanks to BEIS, translated that into English for the UK market. And we've also provided some guidance on space heating diversity. So much more clarity, but much greater clarity on how you use DS439. And there is a very, very good now Annex D developed by FairHeat. So thanks to FairHeat, well done. And that is the sort of diagram at the bottom there, showing a whole process, an example, a case study, if you like, of how you should, and therefore how you should not use DS439. It was being misused after the 2015 version. This is all about tackling the massive issue of oversizing. Next slide, please. So again, huge thanks to my other co-author, Martin Crane, for fantastic work on acceptance testing. We now have a whole new objective. Even in CP1, objective 5.7, setting a whole raft of minimum requirements around how do you do acceptance testing. You can commission a system, but generally that means you turn the pump on, you look at it and you say, oh, it works, great. And you write a number down that you may well have made up. But actually what acceptance testing is about is proving the service to the customer works. We've taken a graduated risk-based approach. So if you're rolling a development out, what is the point in doing acceptance testing on the first 10%, finding there's a generic problem, and then letting it roll out on the other 90%? So actually fix what you see early on. But best practice is to actually carry out independent acceptance testing on 100% of dwellings. And we've now got, and this only went in fairly recently, hence some of the delay, a new requirement on hot water delivery times for 45 degrees C within 45 seconds. That is a customer service and a piece of acceptance testing. And we've put a checklist in that you can see on the right there. So a lot more on proving it works. Next slide, please, Karen. We've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years working on heat interface units, and well done to Gareth chairing the HIU BEIS testing standard committee, and I happen to be a member of that. So we've now got a really good standard for testing heat interface units. CP1 actually says use HIUs that are tested to at least BEIS HIU standard or similar. And there's much more emphasis now in CP1 about achieving low return water temperatures. CP1 best practice says a VWART of less than 33 degrees C. So you can see the direction of travel there for around HIUs. Again, a change to hot water temperatures that I'm sure Andrew Mackay will talk about later, but actually instantaneous HIUs should supply 50 degrees C, no longer 55. So again, a reduction in temperature, but with very strong safety considerations around all of that. Huge thanks to Hugh Blackwell for all his work in that went into CP1 around avoiding oversizing of HIUs. And we now have statements in CP1 saying that for a typical dwelling, you shouldn't need more than 35 kilowatts. So fantastic. People were putting in 70 kilowatts, and you know why. And we've actually got, again, as an example, I'm just picking out one or two bits here and there, CP1 saying heat losses from HIUs should be a maximum of 1 kilowatt hour per day, best practice 0.7. So a lot of work on HIUs. Next slide, please, Gareth. So I'm very pleased that customer satisfaction now runs as a theme. Although it is stage 7 in CP1, it starts at the briefing stage. And so the client actually now has to set down an intention to join up to the Heat Trust or a similar regulatory scheme, not regulatory, but a similar customer protection scheme. And they sign up to that intention right from the beginning, and customer satisfaction now runs right throughout the whole process. So it's not just a technical set of minimum requirements. There's lots around reporting back to the customer, better information to the customer. As I well know, if Mrs. Jones is not happy, then we failed. And so I think this is a very important theme in CP1. Next slide, please, Gareth. So compliance, compliance, compliance. CP1 has an accompanying set of checklists, and as ever, people download the document and they sort of forget about the checklists. These are not add-ons. They're fundamental part of proving that CP1 has been followed and documented, and providing an audit trail. And you can see a snapshot on the right hand side, and these are stage by stage checklists, and they are actually checking, have you met the objectives at the top? In the middle, have you met the performance targets? And at the bottom, signing off and handing over that stage of the work to the next feasibility consultant, and then so on to the design consultant. So it's a stage by stage process. If you don't look at these Excel spreadsheets and checklists, you don't know CP1 endpoint. I think, just go back. I think this provides a platform for assessing 2020 CP1 requirements have been met, but in an outcome-based way at every stage. Next slide, please, Gareth. And that relates very heavily to building an evidence pack. So the checklists go into, at every stage, into an evidence pack. The performance monitoring at every stage goes into the evidence pack. The feasibility study then goes into the evidence pack, and so on. The feasibility study then gets clearly handed over in the evidence pack to the designer, and so on down the chain. This actually is a process rather than just a set of technical requirements, and it provides a connected audit trail that is fundamental to these systems. Given that they are so complex and so many people are involved over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this audit trail and evidence pack is going to be absolutely key, and I believe will be part of the underpinning piece around regulatory, the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So that's me almost done. There is lots more. As I say, that's only a snapshot of what is in CP1. I think it's a huge step forward. Huge thanks to my fellow authors, Paul Woods and Martin Crane. We've all got lots of scars on our back, but it's been worth it. Huge thanks to the expert steering committee of up to 50 people, including corresponding members. Well over 100 contributors and commentators, thanks to them. And poor old Phil, Paul and Martin had to go through over 3,000 comments over 3 rounds of consultation. But particular a message back to Mike Ridge and Tom Norton and Gareth is huge thanks for all your input. You've had a massive input, including that appendix. So an epic journey of probably 2.5 years, huge consensus. It is still work in progress, in my view, on a much longer journey, but it does provide a platform for the future. I do believe it will underpin the regulatory framework that was talked about earlier. May the code be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and congratulations. I think it's a big step forward for the industry. We're now moving on to dealing with the issue of the skills gap. We've talked through the big challenge we've got for the industry, and we've now got Tanya Groth from Sweco going to talk to us about the skills gap and the research that's been done on that front.
Thanks, Gareth. Also, I'd like to really congratulate Phil on getting that out into the industry. I know my colleagues, CIBSE colleagues, they are keenly going through it at the moment. I think it might have been the most hotly awaited book to land in 2021. So congrats again for getting all of that collated and published. Yes, I'm presenting on the basis of research that was conducted in 2020, and that is on the status of heat network skills across the UK. And this was research that was conducted with our partners. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. There we go. Collaboration with key partners, the ACE research team from the ADE, IFF research, ourselves as a minor party, and then of course a shout out to particularly Melissa and Brett at the Clean Heat Directorate, who were our clients and who contributed significantly to the report itself. Key points I want to, sorry, it's still not. Am I in charge still of the screen or somebody?
Unfortunately, it's not. You let me know and I'll let you know when it goes across.
Perfect, thanks, Gareth. So just quickly, overview of the different project stages. Basically, this was a literature review plus stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement was one-to-one telephone conversations and workshops. Please click through. Covered about 6 months of research, and then we published, drafted and published the report. Key findings. Good news, the industry currently across the UK is well equipped and able to accommodate the current size of the heat network market. But as Gareth, Caroline and Shivali were commenting earlier, there's going to be a step change in how quickly we're going to be delivering heat networks going forward. And what we are not ready for is that step change. Also, what was flagged was a lack of diversity in a gender diversity in a male-dominated industry, but somewhat more positively, I guess, was there isn't much concern about an age gap in that there's not in other industries face a current risk that senior members of the industry are retiring and there's a knowledge gap left behind. The heat network industry in the UK, partially because of its youth and energism, and partially because the demands and the technologies within the sector are innovating so quickly, is not facing that same age skills gap. So that would be the positive story on that. Next slide, please, Gareth. This is a slide that demonstrates all the different sectors that contribute to delivering a heat network project across its lifetime. Actually, it's not all of them; it's most of them, I would say. As we all know, heat networks are incredibly complex, not just because of the way they interface with building construction and energy efficiency improvements and the electricity system and different fuel arrangements, but also because of that stakeholder engagement piece, which is so crucial, understanding the customers, understanding their thermal demands, both on heating and hot water, understanding comfortable heating for them, explaining to them how their heat network system works. So across the kind of life cycle of development of a heat network project, you get various varying degrees of involvement from different sectors across the industry. Next slide, please. And just click through, I think. So a great example of this is, and stop when you hit project management there, thank you. A great example of this is if you look at what the role of a project manager in a heat network is, they really need to be able to understand the construction and surveying bits, the engineering bits, the architecture bits, the public administration and urban planning, legal and financial, energy supply, IT, installation, the whole shebang they need to be able to get on top of. Click once more, please. And I have to, yes, perfect, just keep clicking twice more. There we go. In terms of that, have a newfound respect for project managers within the heat network industry. In terms of skills and challenges identified across the industry, the blue points kind of highlight particular issues that we're facing. Restricted recruitment pools, partially because the younger generations, the ones coming fresh-faced out of the universities, aren't necessarily aware of what heat networks are. Linking back to that slide Caroline was presenting earlier from the research done by the Energy Technologies Institute on knowledge about what heat networks are in general, I think. You need a blend of skills. It's necessary to function as in the heat network industry. For myself, I'm an economist, but in order to work in the heat network industry, I really do need at least some understanding of technologies involved and how the components link into one another. Also need to understand bits of stakeholder engagement and a little bit of legal and IT skills on top of that. And that's just as an economist, and my role is very trivial in terms of a heat network delivery. But that blend of skills is necessary. So you don't tend to see a lot of engineers working across multiple sectors and partially working on heat networks. They really do have to have a solid foundation of what a heat network is, which is why it's so great, again, that the update to CP1's come out. 3 skilled senior roles are in short supply. So we don't have a lot of existing knowledge to lean on, because the industry as a whole has been less developed. And that also means that the fact that the industry as a whole is less developed also means that individuals' roles can't solely be focused on heat networks, because there might not be enough of them for them to fully focus on it, which is a bit of a conflict, right? Because on the one end, you need someone with a solid grounding of heat networks and to really specialize in understanding what a heat network is. But on the other hand, we might not have enough work to fully keep them occupied. And then 5, fewer graduates also attracted into the sector. It's not as sexy as electric vehicles, where you've got Tesla looking cool, riding fly. It's not as cool as working on the really large scale wind turbines. At least that's the perception. It's something we probably as a sector need to invest more time in making look good to attract others. Please click on the next slide, Gareth. So skills lacking by occupations. Again, project delivery managers, specifically around really understanding what a heat network is. You also get things like legal advisors. They really need to understand where all of the risks are in terms of a heat network, and the amount of risks involved in building a heat network, from technical, from in customer expectations point of view, from IT angles, all of that is so tricky. So if you are setting up contractual agreements and you don't understand where all those risk elements are, that can create a lot of challenges going down the line. Thank you. Click on next slide, please. So current skills gaps and the impacts on networks. What do we get? We get delays to the development of heat networks because finding the right people with the right skills to deliver heat networks takes a longer time. I think anybody involved in public sector procurement knows how difficult it can be to get consultants with the right type of experience bid for a role, or the right type of contractors who have the same technology experience as the specific technology chosen for the initial heat network. You get lower quality projects. We've all seen examples of those. They cost more to deliver because skills are at a premium. And then there's a reliance on subcontractors, and that can create issues. It can also be great. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but generally speaking, when you don't have enough understanding in-house, it creates issues. For example, going back to Phil's presentation around setting up that client brief, if the client doesn't have those skills in-house, they might have to rely on subcontractors, and that isn't always optimal. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? Well, in the short term, there's a number of initiatives that are being explored. So employer-led partnerships, encouraging trade associations to respond to calls for evidence, promoting the sector to young people, and then liaising with energy hubs and local enterprise partnerships. Midterm, you've got. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I would say encouraging the CPD schemes and also exploring the collection of data so we can keep an eye on it. This heat network skills study, which was undertaken alongside a similar one for Scotland, similar time frame, and also had similar findings, which was, I guess, a relief for both of us, is that there's not a lot of data on heat network skills out there. These were the first. Last year was the first year we actually did. There was actual proper research conducted into what the status of heat network skills in the UK is. What are the gaps? What do we need to be doing? And then finally, looking at longer term initiatives. And it was really great to see that there are specific targeted courses being drafted now for university students up in Scotland. It's something that would be great to see more widely as well, but it's, you know, starting with that longer term investment into the education and skills that we need for the industry. Next slide, please. This is just coming to the end now. So these are a number of initiatives that are going on at the moment. You've got the Heat Academy, you've got the Heat Network Industry Council, the Heat Network Exchange, et cetera, the Heat Exchanger. And a shout out to my colleague Mert, who helped with the SWECO side of the Heat Network skills research, and who's also was one of the first mentees in the Heat Exchanger program and has been actively involved in the second round. I think that is a great mentee mentorship and addresses some of the particular challenges we found in our study, which is about how do you insource more skills in a smaller organization where you might not have access to the same training and development opportunities, or can lean on senior members of staff to the same degree because the organization is too small to sustain them. So the Heat Exchanger is a really great initiative launched through the membership of the District Heating Divas originally, which is also surprised to see how many women actually were involved in the heat network industry in the UK. I had not expected it to be the several hundreds that are now members of the Divas, but it's been reassuring to see. And then the final slide. So that was pretty much it from my end for this. Feel free to pop questions through the chat to discuss through our panel discussion later. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Much appreciated. Okay, so we're now final talk before we have a discussion. Noah Nkonge is going to talk to us about Vattenfall's view of how the industry will respond to this.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, FairHeat, for inviting us to speak today. I'm going to be covering...
We're having problems here. Just tell me when you want me to swap.
I'm going to be covering the view from industry on all the excellent presentations that have come before, looking at the decarbonisation challenge, and then also talking about the role of regulation. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to do my best to not go over the same ground that's already been covered beforehand. So let's go to the next slide, please. And just before I get into the core, I just want to give a very brief introduction, because some people may not know who Vattenfall is and what we're doing here. So Vattenfall is is the 5th largest energy company in Europe. And across the heat business, we have about 1.8 million customers. And Vattenfall is a sort of integrated energy company across electricity, heat, gas, and energy services. And we have large heat networks across in Amsterdam, in Berlin, and also in Sweden. So if you, next slide, please. And Vattenfall decided to enter the UK market about 3 years ago, because as Shivali was mentioning, there was the government support with the funding, those commitments, the binding climate change targets, and also property developers and local authorities were calling out for heat solutions that would allow decarbonisation of their developments. And what I really wanted to bring out from this slide is the type of projects that relate to what we think needs to happen in terms of the scale and the ways of working to meet net zero from the heat network perspective. And this is very much along projects that have the potential to build up at scale and working in partnership, bringing together local authorities, private developers, and waste heat sources as well. So Brent Cross South is an example where we're working in partnership with a private developer to regenerate an area in North London, which would serve about 10,000 homes equivalent. In Midlothian, we've been selected as an energy partner for the council, initially looking at a scheme of about 3,000 homes, but this has the potential to expand northwards and capture existing buildings. And then Corey Riverside as well, we've got partnership there with the energy from waste operator. Again, potential for 10,000 homes initially, that could expand up to 75,000 homes in due course, and then capturing the existing buildings as we go. Next slide, please. So this slide covers a lot of the similar ground actually that's been talked about in terms of the scale of the challenge. And I think from your numbers, Gareth, it translates to about 500 boilers a day that we need to be taking out and replacing with low carbon heat solutions if we're to meet our net zero targets. And really, I'll just jump to say, the key thing is that we've got a big challenge ahead of us. And, as there hasn't been much increase in the penetration of heat networks over the last few years, and therefore we will need that some support from market framework to help that. And we've covered a lot of those themes already. And let's move on to the next slide, please. I think Phil talked really well about the whole process, and I'm really excited to see the launch of CP1 and those checks that are going to happen at each of those stages. And really what I want to communicate is that us as an ESCO, as part of our business, we come across standards all the way through the project lifecycle, all the way through design and operation. And one thing that we're keen to do is work with our clients very early, as early as possible actually, up at the design stage, even if somebody else doing the design, because we know how important it is to get good standards in, because that will affect the operation over 30, 40, 50 years plus of a network. Yeah, next slide, please. So, as an industry, as an ESCO industry, we cannot afford to wait for the government before we start adopting these common standards. We've already got CP1 here. We don't need to wait for regulation to start telling us to use these excellent standards. And ultimately, they'll be of benefit to all the different stakeholders. They'll drive up quality in the heat networks. They'll drive down cost and risk. It'll make the job a lot easier for clients who don't have to look at different specs and different designs and get confused about that, and iron out the risk in delivering the projects, because there's that clarity of, the heat network is going to do what it says on the tin, to paraphrase Phil. And it's good for our customers because, as was mentioned, there's a low understanding of heat networks and heat decarbonisation options in general, actually. And so we need to build consumer confidence and have reliability and peace of mind, not only for the end customer, but for developers who are going to be working with those customers ultimately in the buildings. And for ESCOs and the industry, it's great because we get the shared learning through, for example, that's captured in those, example in the codes of practice, etc., which helps streamline the design and de-risk the delivery of heat networks, which actually means that the cost of capital can go down once we have a better understanding of performance. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our approach is to be ahead of regulation as Vattenfall. We welcome common technical standards, and we're already designing and delivering our heat networks now to be compliant with what we expect the standards to be, or some cases exceed where that's appropriate. So we're comfortable with regulation from our European operations. There was already mention of the Danish standards used for the sizing of pipes, for example. And we haven't been waiting for CP1 to start implementing some of the guidance that's already in there. So the use of low temperature heat networks. We don't specify CHP and gas boilers as part of our mission. We want to be fossil free in generation and power climate smarter living. So what that means for us is we don't specify any fossil fuels where possible. We don't specify gas CHP. It's very hard for us to get projects approved by the business that still include combustion. And if there is a need to have gas boilers, for example, for peaking plants, there's always needs to be a route to zero carbon. And that relates to that last bullet point about the specification, for example, of 50 degrees hot water production at heat interface units, because that really opens up the potential to make use of waste heat from the local environment, which is a key pillar of how we approach projects. Before putting in new equipment, we really need to make use of the heat that's available in the local area. Next slide, please. So yeah, to sort of bring that all together, to meet the heat decarbonisation challenge, we're very supportive of a market framework that will unlock this, and that includes regulation and assurance. And we're keen to work with all stakeholders to help with this. We are represented on the boards for the Heat Network Industry Council, which is looking at pathways for achieving heat decarbonisation. I myself am chairing the working group on smart livable cities, which looks at zoning, how we address the retrofit market, and importantly also digitalisation, because as a couple of the speakers mentioned, there's going to be a coupling of electricity and heat and opportunities with the flexibility market. And so what's going to be really important with heat networks is how do we know what's happening on the heat network to allow us to, for example, reduce the strain on the electricity grid, as an example. And as I mentioned, we want to be ahead of regulation, and we can't afford to wait if we're to meet the heat decarbonisation challenge. So next slide, please. So yes, thank you everybody for listening, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Noah. So we've got a panel discussion and Q&A now. So we've got some questions through. If anyone else wants to send through questions, that'd be great. So if everyone, I will stop the share. And if we could take off your, share your video. Hi guys, so great, thanks for that. We're only 20 minutes over, which I think is unsurprising. That was really interesting. I think there are a few things that we talked about exploring, and thanks a lot for a sort of pre-session we had where we got to discuss some things through. I think one of the things I'd like to go on to zoning early in this and have some discussion about zoning. And one of the things which I really wanted to just ask, because I think coming back to the COVID question at the start, we've seen a lot of change. We've seen a lot of change to behaviour, and from data we've seen a shifting out of peak loads and actually a flattening of peak loads. A couple of questions in relation to that. We're also seeing a change in retail sector. So, is that going to be long term? Do you think that some of the transformation we've seen over the last year is long term, and will that have an impact on the distribution of heat loads geographically? And also, do you think that some of the changes in profile we've seen will be with us on a long term? Shivali, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks, Gareth. Some really interesting questions there. Agree with you on this whole pandemic situation has possibly changed the thinking and the way we use energy at the minute. The demand profiles for public sector buildings has changed, for other commercial buildings, industries. It's impacted quite a lot. But again, going back to zoning, I think it entails the identification of areas which can be readily connected to a low carbon heat network, and mandating the connection unless it is not cost effective to do so. Obviously, it's quite important to see that. But I think it's an interesting profile to watch possibly. And I think Caroline mentioned about flexibility. I think it goes in two ways. One is, yes, the DNOs significantly having some sort of a mechanism to incentivize, but flexibility in another way, that when we look at the methodology for zoning and making these heat network zones, we don't tie ourselves to situation or to heat demands now. Having that flexibility in the system that 20 years hence as well, or even 3 years hence, we can adapt to the hybrid structure. So if I'm 3 days in the office this week and another 3 days, different days in the next week, the profile generally, aggregated profile will change. But the system has to be flexible. And I think it comes to another thing which you said about the optimization of networks is the controls, the BMS systems. That plays a big role, I would say. So it's, I hope I've given a little bit of thought on that question.
Tanya.
Yeah, no, Shivali, Totally agree, particularly with respect to the digitalization elements that we're hastily moving towards. But I'm wondering that the long-term impacts of the change in thermal demand that's resulted from a change in how we work and live. I mean, on the plus side, more diversification should be a good thing for designing heat networks, right? So it improves balancing opportunities. And then your point, Shivali, about tying that in with the local grid infrastructure, and can we be using that thermal storage to help offset peaks and troughs in the electricity system, potentially in combination with heat pumps. But then is there going to be sufficient heat demand of a size given the changes to, I mean, are we going to have sufficient heat demand as we are moving towards increased energy efficiency to justify the capital expenditure necessary, the upfront capital expenditure necessary to put those pipes in the ground in the first place? This is one of those conundrums that I think we're always struggling with. I would say yes, but others would say very strong no. So I'm kind of curious how we could wrap that in with all the uncertainty going on about what our future thermal demand profiles are going to look like. What do you guys think is going to be happening fundamentally to the way we design heat networks?
Phil, you.
I totally agree with what's been said. I think there is going to be a shift of a big change in the retail high street and away from large sort of shopping malls and that sort of thing. I think those will change in heat demand very considerably. I think we'll see a very different shape to domestic heating, because a lot more people are going to be working from home for those 2 days a week that you mentioned, Tanya. But I wanted to throw in the other big change, which is the rise of cooling. And cooling is heat. And actually, what are we going to do about that rise? And I'm spending quite a bit of time at the moment working on a project where we're sharing heating with cooling. One person's heat provides another person's cooling, and that prosuming is where we need to head to really reduce carbon. But it's tackling two problems: the heat decarbonisation, in inverted commas, but the cool decarbonisation as well at the same time. And I'm not sure that traditional views of heat networks will address those two key problems.
Actually, Phil, can I pick up on 2 points there? I want to throw it back. I think there are two interesting things. So Shivali earlier mentioned mandating connection. And do you think we're actually going to oblige people? Are we going to get to the point where we oblige people to connect? And to make that work, my view is that zoning is only going to work if you do. But I do have some concerns that if we don't, and we're not hard enough on it, you know, if you set the bar too low to, you know, the cost of not joining, then everyone will find reasons. And again, coming back, picking on your point, Phil, about this sort of prosuming, we've seen often, you know, we've seen new developments where you've got a supermarket within it, and they've got all this, you know, effectively they're extracting heat out of the building to cool it, yeah, and they're not interested in connecting that portion through to the rest of the development as heat, because it's not part of their core business. How do you again get people to actually be incentivized to be part of that? Shivali, sorry.
Really good point there, Gareth. I know I want to say a couple of things on this. So I think it was touch based about the heat networks and penetration in the market from an awareness perspective. And I think it's quite important to say here that the sector's confidence growth will increase with regulation, but also with a higher demand assurance. In the end, for investors, is the double-digit growth as well, or the commercial IRR is equally important, let's just face it. And mandating connections, either we do it centrally or locally, or we don't do it, whatever, it is clearly a mechanism for reducing the connection risk. Again, but that's increasing then the confidence of the sector to invest into the heat network as well. But it's important that we explore these granting powers to local authorities to mandate because we can't look at heat now as a single vector, it's quite important to see a multi-vector approach. I think Tanya mentioned about the storage earlier, then it's about the generation. We have already announced moving from 10 gigawatt hour to 40 gigawatt hour of wind generation. There are solar farms coming up. And then it's the big beast of electric vehicles. So it's important that we understand what is there in the local area planning for environment, infrastructure, and the place. And I agree, we will work with the local authorities to optimize the delivery of this and have the related interventions. But to answer this question, I think it's not entirely on its own. Can we just mandate this building? You know, I mean, it's quite a multi-vector approach to be seen with local area planning. That's my view.
No, can we go Noah and then Caroline?
Yeah, and picking up on this, there's been some talk of mandating. I think it's not just about mandating, it goes along with incentives as well. So it's both carrot and stick that we need to look at to see how to make the transition, because decarbonising heat will come at a cost. And therefore, it does open up a question as, how do we share that cost and who should be paying? So I don't think it's as simple as saying, thou shalt connect, full stop, and you've got to take all the costs, because we don't think all the costs should be borne by the end consumer. And relating to zoning as well, and this element of choice, I think there's a question. It's not just about heat networks. It just so happens that delivering heat networks is the most complex of the heat solutions. And therefore, if you can crack heat networks, then actually it will help for the hydrogen where that's appropriate, or heat pumps. So we're not saying, we should put heat networks everywhere. We should put heat networks where there is the density of demand, but we just need that certainty to say, right, this area is for heat networks, that's individual heat pumps. This area might work for hydrogen, for example.
Caroline.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on actually the comments that have been said. I think, firstly, I think it's really important when we are having this discussion to think about the impact of zoning will probably be quite different between domestic buildings and non-domestic. I think it's far more reasonable to talk about obligation to connect for non-domestics than it is perhaps for domestic buildings, or it's a more difficult, more complex discussion, I think, which is the first thing I just wanted to say. I think secondly, as well, I think just as Noah was saying, the question of how you shift the current market for gas boiler refurb in the UK is something that is not just unique to heat networks, and getting boiler refurbishment off the table, whether it's then a connection to heat networks, whether it's heat pumps at an individual scale, whether eventually it's hydrogen, I think is something that we're going to need to crack alongside of putting in further support and incentives for connecting to heat networks in the right areas.
Actually, Caroline, I wanted to extend on from that, because you actually put it in your slide earlier, this question around the level playing field between heat networks and other utilities, and in particular, if we start going through and making investments into, for example, hydrogen and to gas networks, is this all just kicking the can down the road in terms of keeping those assets working? And then by doing that, are we then actually frustrating, potentially putting a block to the development of heat networks? Should we, how do we make sure that it is a level playing field?
That's a really hard question. I guess all I would say to it, I think where we are at is that I think when you look at industrial decarbonisation, I think it's really important that we keep hydrogen on the table as an option. I think we have, say, for example, in our membership in the AD, we have big energy intensives where hydrogen may be one of the most reasonable ways for them to decarbonise. And I think so that needs to be part of the picture. I guess, perhaps on a personal level, I think there's a real question that we need to be getting into quickly about our appetite for stranded assets in the next decade or so, and who bears the risk for that. I think if I'm being perhaps a little blunt, I think the government's current position, where we want really fast progress towards electrification of heat at an individual level, the massive growth in heat networks in the kind of next decade, in the 2020s, whilst keeping our options open for the kind of repurposing of the gas network for hydrogen, I'm not sure is entirely compatible when you get into the detail of this. And I think we do need to make some decisions now in terms of shifting the balance to support heat electrification, and perhaps accept that you know, that creates some risk, and we need some appetite for that in terms of eventually the relative contributions of these different pathways.
Tanya, you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. I mean, around the zoning thing, I mean, Scotland's been moving along with their heat and energy efficiency strategy work, which is essentially looking at whether it's suitable to be setting up zoning, not just looking at heat elements, so whether provision of individual or communal heat pumps and heat networks, but also looking at what energy efficiency improvements need to be made, because I don't think we can really we can't really maximize the value that heat networks bring unless we are also implementing energy efficiency alongside that, both to help reduce to help manage the diversification of profiles, but just as importantly, it's to be able to introduce both new developments and existing developments onto the same heat network infrastructure, building heat networks so that they are designed to only deliver to, for example, new developments and cannot accommodate existing developments, because those existing developments have completely different temperature requirements, for one. That is not a sound strategy for future proofing. So looking at heat networks in isolation in terms of both the commercial case and the stranded assets element that Caroline was coming in on, unless we are looking at the energy efficiency improvements needed to retrofit existing buildings alongside the business case for heat networks, I think we're exposing ourselves to a higher risk of stranded assets in the future. So yeah, kudos to Scottish Government for doing the local heat and energy efficiency strategy work up front. It's something in terms of, if we're really going to be seriously looking at zoning in England and Wales as well, it's something we should be really pushing for, that integrated approach to energy efficiency and thermal networks. And then just finally, that multi-vector approach that Shivali mentioned, and the cooling, so thermal energy being heating and cooling. You know, you need that energy efficiency element if you want to be combining the existing buildings, having those take advantage of that cooling. Because I can tell you, August, you know, I'm going to not be in my flat in August in London this year. I think I almost died of heat stroke last summer, working from home during the peak of the summer season with no cooling available. You know, our buildings just are not built for the summers that we're getting these days. And you need both the energy efficiency element and the thermal network element to address that.
Tanya, I'm going to make a jump now. Sorry, everyone. But there's one element that you talked about just there, which is interconnection. And I want to pick up on a couple of different aspects of that. One, we're seeing lots of different networks in areas. So a lot of the time we talk about large-scale heat networks. But I'm a little bit worried, and I know, sorry, Caroline, I put my hand on this in the ADE all the time, say, remember that actually most of the heat networks aren't these big, massive developments historically. Most heat networks are being built at a development level or even retrofitted at a development level. And longer term, we're looking to interconnections of those. And I think there are a few things we need to go into there. One, should we be being a lot stronger in terms of stipulating certain temperature regimes in when we come back to zoning, because I get quite concerned that we have these different buildings being built near each other on heat networks running at very different temperatures. There is one element of that. The other is, are we going to get interconnection? How? Because we keep on talking about this, keep on talking about district heating ready, you know, that's in London Plan, but we don't see a lot of examples of people actually going and interconnecting afterwards, these schemes. How are we going to make that happen? So if I could just start with those two, if I could. Anyone want to tackle that? Phil, you put up your hand earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was going back to heat zones, but I'll try and answer what is a very difficult question. So I've been frustrated by that for probably the last 5 years at least, if not longer, that these communal blocks have been going up, the Canary Wharf blocks, as I call them, without the real ability to interconnect. But what it comes down to is there's not that much incentive to interconnect. But I'm sorry to go harp on about the project that I'm working on at the moment, but actually, if you connect a data center to 5 Canary Wharf blocks, the data center can heat those 5 Canary Wharf blocks. And that's exactly what we're doing in a 5th generation scheme in Islington called Green Skies. Look it up. But actually, It's that sort of integration that might allow or provide the incentive to put the pipes in to connect it all together. Otherwise, it's not going to work. There's no incentive. Gas is too cheap. End of. RHI, the loss of RHI and gas being too cheap. If that if playing field is not leveled up, then actually we are always really going to struggle, because heat generally is too cheap. Why would you want to interconnect? My answer is interconnect at a low temperature so that you can recover data center heat or ventilation tunnel heat.
No?
Yeah, and building on that, yeah, completely resonate. Heat is way too cheap at the moment. That's definitely an issue which brings challenges. And we talked about not having incentives. And I think part of the challenge about interconnecting the existing networks is how can we bring in points of intervention when, for example, new planning applications are going in, replacement of existing boiler kit, as an example, for housing developments, when it comes time to change the heating system. And so having those points simply where you have to consider either upgrading your system or lowering the temperatures or connecting into a heat network, those things are currently not there. There's no education for a customer, building owner, homeowner on those kind of things. So I think there's an opportunity as this kind of the overall market framework to bring in that education, bringing those points where intervention can happen. And again, touching on Phil's point of incentives, currently, as I see it, the costs have to be borne by the ESCO or the end customer to connect, to do these interconnections, and then it just doesn't stack up, and then we're sort of caught in that vicious circle. So again, it comes back into how are we funding the cost, because it seems that we're not quite tackling that head on.
Shivali, that seems like a good point to come to you.
Yeah, I was just going to expand to Noah. I agree. Being an engineer, I agree the importance of the low temperature network and moving from high temp to low temp for more futuristic thinking. But parallelly, I think we need to recognize I have to be very careful here. We have to recognize what is our supply chain at the minute. Going to low temperature, and I think we see it in our houses as well. The moving from a boiler to heat pump in a very small scale, if you are seeing a direct impact on the emitters. Take it in a bigger scale for heat network, where you've got mixed technologies, almost bespoke for every project. You might have waste coming from an energy from waste plant or from a mined water heat pump. You might be looking more for radiators, and in the cases of ambient loops, you're looking for underflow heating. And I'm just trying to emphasize that we need to parallelly think about the skills and supply chain in the industry before we go on full-on mandatation and making it, as a really something to follow on from now on, sort of a thing. So it's a slow burner. I think Caroline mentioned before about the stranded assets. It's a stepwise approach, and reinforcing what Daniel said about the energy efficiency. That will, I think, automatically leave us to low temperatures networks as well. There is a slow transition, but I think the awareness and the whole industry working together, from consultants to clients to consumers, it will happen. I believe, Gareth, as you said, the change needs to happen, and I think it will happen with all of us working together.
Couple of things. So I'm going to make a jump in topic now. I note it's coming up for 11. If it's okay, we're going to extend by, because we ran over by 20 minutes, we're going to extend by 15 minutes. Is that okay for everyone in the group? Okay. Just want to flag that. I'd like to move on to standards and quality now. CP1 2020 is great because it actually sets minimum requirements, and numerically you have objective targets within it. And we heard from Mariota earlier about the need for assurance, and this general shift towards compliance is part of what we need to achieve. Effectively, we need heat networks to work well. We need to lift the bottom up in the market in order to protect customers. A question back, because we're going to have heat network assurance as part of the market framework coming through 2022. Is there a risk that we get backlash from the industry with this just being seen as adding an additional cost? What are the views here on that? Mariota?
I'd like to sort of, even just look at this concept of, the status quo and our concept of being comfortable with being comfortable and taking a long-term view. Often, with these sorts of decisions, they're driven by, numbers rather than sort of long-term vision. And I think this is the challenge for industry leaders. Culture drives decision-making. And so whether or not you view this as a cost or whether or not you view this as a long-term investment, because the goal is, as an industry, to grow from 2% to 20% or to even go greater. So, I think that's the big challenge is, if there is backlash, I think the challenge back to the industry is to say, where's your leadership? Where is your culture of moving beyond, just viewing this as a cost? And I think that's a challenge to reflect back to industry.
Phil?
Gareth, good design shouldn't cost more. My view is follow CP1. All you're doing is good design. And all we're doing is raising the bottom, as you said, of poor design into good design. It shouldn't cost any more. And procedurally, it shouldn't cost more. There may be a bit of a learning curve on the first couple that you do. But actually, after that, it should be just sort of day to day and actually not costing any more, but saving lots of carbon. So I think it's almost a misnomer that we are going to regulate ourselves out of business, as it were. And I do go back to what Noah was saying, that and it was only in heat zones, but actually it's sticks and carrots, and those sticks and carrots have got to be nicely balanced. That is the next big challenge, is sort of finding that balance within the new regulatory framework. But Noah also said something really important, which is, let's get on with it. And no disrespect to BEIS, no, I'm trying to help and support them, love them. But I think it's for the industry to get on with it now in the spirit that Noah was suggesting.
So how do we make sure that it just doesn't become, because we've seen so often when certification comes in, it becomes a drive to the bottom, a rubber stamping exercise, people drop costs and don't, how do we make sure that doesn't happen here?
Well, nobody else is pitching in, so I'll try again. So my view of CP1 is, look, we had a go at it in 2015, but with the view that in a few years' time we'll up the ante, and then turn the screw up more, and then turn up, and that is the process. That is the long journey we are on, and actually that will raise standards on a every 3 to 5 year basis, such that and it is a long time, but maybe 10 years, we're actually all really doing fantastic design that would have been seen as unattainable previously.
No, you?
Yeah, and I've worked in sort of the design side in previous times, and I think having the guide, even if it's to say, you should consider these things and you should do a checklist at these design stages, I think that would be immensely useful, because the sense I get, for at least from the side of the design, is that different people, some people are doing too little in the design, some people are doing too much, and then people are spending a lot of time is wasted actually, when actually if we can have the regulations that say these are the key things that you need to consider, that's actually very helpful. Will actually cut down in the time of the design. And on the point of the costs as well, will this cost more for the industry? Actually, I think it's people don't see the time that's lost going back and forth with designs in the design process, in the adoption process, when people say, oh, I'm not adopting that asset, it's not according to standards, it needs to be made right. All that time that's lost is not captured as well. I think it's worth raising.
Tanya.
Yeah, well, going back to your original point there, Gareth, about what it might be more costly to introduce compliance, I'd challenge that from the viewpoint of, are you talking about lifetime cost of the network there, or are you just thinking about the upfront costs? Because I think it's only the upfront costs that might increase, as Phil's saying, there's a learning curve involved, but lifetime costs of delivering a heat network, of operating a heat network, I mean, that should definitely be decreasing because it's based on better design, right? And I think that ties in also with the point Caroline made about a level playing field. Why should the heat network industry be the only one exempt from compliance? Pretty much every other industry, every other sector in the UK is governed by compliance. Why would we be the only exception? That doesn't make any sense either, does it?
I think you're going to be unsurprised to hear that I deeply agree with you. And in fact, unfortunately, half of our business at FairHeat is going and dealing with problem sites. So half our business is new build going through assurance side. The other half is going and trying to deal with these train wrecks after they've happened. And in almost every case, they're avoidable. And the cost of something going wrong is way, way higher than actually going through and getting things right from the start, and the impact on customers. And I don't think we have time to go through. I was going to ask about how do we avoid the Grenfell type situation, because I'm really concerned with the end of the day, when these sites go wrong and when schemes go wrong, who ends up paying? Who ends up, it's generally the end consumer, the end resident who's left with that, and they can be trapped in with these very costly. We've got schemes that we're dealing with only 2-3 years old, where all the pipework's having to be replaced because no one dealt with water quality from the outset. So I think it's really, really important that we put these checks and balances in. I want to leap on to skills gap. Tanya, you mentioned diversity as an issue. You mentioned trying to get grads in an issue. How are we going to encourage bright young things into our industry?
Explain how incredibly sexy it is to work in the heat network segment, I think, is a good start. I mean, we might not be as cool as the other sectors, but that's because we are smoking hot, right? So I think the branding wise would go a long way. I mean, also because, again, coming back to heat is such an underrated thing. Heat is thermal comfort in your home is the thing you notice when it's not there. If it's there, if it's functioning appropriately, nobody ever thinks about it. And it just needs to, be low cost, needs to be there. And it's such a huge life improving factor. And if it's not there, it's damaging in all kinds of ways. It's damaging to health and well-being of citizens, to their ability to concentrate, to their ability to sleep. It's damaging to our healthcare system because you've got more people sick, taking up beds in NHS. It's damaging to the buildings themselves because we're reducing the longevity because they have moisture problems. I mean, it's technically speaking, it's a win-win situation to be focusing on thermal comfort, but I don't think we're good enough at branding how important thermal comfort is, how integral it is to the health, the well-being, both the physical and mental health and well-being of all of us around. I think actually COVID in that sense gives us a great platform for stepping out and really highlighting how important the sector is as a whole, because everybody's been stuck at home for so long, have really been noticing how drafty their windows are. So the energy efficiency element, how much they're paying for their heating because they have to have their heating on all the time during the winter. People have been noticing these things more. So there is more of an awakening interest that we could be riding the back of. But I honestly think it's branding. I mean, we don't have the superstar. You look at like renewable electricity. You've got pictures of windmills and solar panels. You look at you Google pictures of electric vehicles. You've got beautiful Tesla. You Google pictures of heat networks, and what do you think we get? We just don't have the same kind of brand awareness. I think that brand awareness, I think that would go a huge step. And also just to tie in with that, all the graduates that we have, all the young people who come and work within SWECO and the heat network side, and I'm assuming this is also the case for you at FairHeat with all the graduates that you have, they're coming to the thermal energy side and the heat networks in particular because of the climate emergency, and they recognize the impact that heat networks can have in terms of decarbonizing our heat segment, and they also are intrigued by the complexities and the challenges presented by decarbonizing heat. So in that sense, really using this year where we've got COP26 happening in Glasgow, individually as organizations, but hopefully also, to echo Shivali's words earlier, that should all be coming together as an industry and helping each other out here, not just in terms of addressing the issue, but getting the right people, the right talent into our industry to help us rise to the challenge is kind of key, especially this year, I'd say.
Great. Shivali, you want to come in?
Yeah. Gareth, first of all, I would like to congratulate and thank you as well. In just last year, I think you've expanded your team to nearly double, or you've added 1/3.
Yeah, added a half, yeah.
You know, just seeing from the faces as well, it looked like a very young team. And so I think you've already made a good progress. And it's many organizations we heard last year, because we did a lot of stakeholder engagement for COVID and for other things as well. We see apprenticeships going on like really actively in the industry as well. I think the need has been identified. And again, thanks to Tanya for your skills research, which you put on LinkedIn as well, and everybody would access it. I think it's now inevitable. And online virtual courses, I think it's become so easy now to access them, and people are taking that step to make some of them free as well, which is helping in this. I agree with you, Gareth, it probably needs to be fast-tracked a bit. I think it'll happen slowly. Now, I'll give you an example of one project really quickly in Durham. At CIBSE, you might have heard about the project from Toland Construction. So they're developing this heat network. I think it's around £4 million investment from HNIP. But I think the project has £175 million. But one thing which really caught my eye was they're having a talent academy, which they're looking to establish, and that will have young people apprenticeships, around 960 jobs from that. So I think these are the numbers we need to start looking at, that what's happening, and maybe then give it more PR. And as Tanya said, Tanya, you were quite right. A couple of years back when I was looking at European images, you know, when you Google heat networks and European image comes up, and there was like big incinerator with caterpillar face on it. I'm like, God, yeah, that's the best. So we can definitely do more PR together.
So I'm going to take the last couple of questions, then I think we need to get into others. Phil?
A quick one. There are no career paths. There are just no courses, no career paths. So if somebody did feel that heat networks and pictures of trenching were sexy, where would they go? Where would they take their spade to dig trenches, to put pipes in and stuff? It's just not there. And I'm working with London South Bank University. I work at London South Bank University. We're going to develop some courses around district heating.
No.
Yeah, just briefly on this point, I think it's really important. I think I want to bring another angle to it, which is which links into the certainty. If we know that these are the kind of technologies we're going to do, and we're going to do heat networks in these areas, it allows us, coming from an ESCO perspective, to invest ahead of needs. We know that these areas are going to need heat networks. Therefore, let's get more apprenticeships in. Let's work more with the universities and get people and work with developing the local supply chain as well. So having that certainty allows us to invest ahead of need. But in this place of uncertainty where we're not sure if where the policy is going to go, it makes that bit more difficult. So we're really keen, and having that supportive framework will help, I think, as well with the skills gap.
I think we need to leap on to some questions from the floor very quickly. One thing I will note on that, we have almost exclusively hired in, I think we brought in 17 chemical engineers over the last few years. And one of the big differences we note here is that heat networks aren't part of the core curriculum, chemical engineering degrees, whereas you go across to Denmark and they are part of the core curriculum. And I think we need to, come back to your point, Phil, actually make sure that they're starting to be included. But we got over 300 applicants this year for 4 posts. So I think there is starting to be that sort of interest there. Question from Dave Lancaster. An interesting measure in one of the graphs shows that knowledge of heat networks has not increased. Why does the panel feel that knowledge is not increasing with the obvious benefits of the systems? Tanya.
Well, actually, what I wanted to comment on there, I thought that was a great question. I saw it. Now, I am sitting in Denmark at the moment, and in Denmark, you've got almost 70% of all residential homes their heating demands are met through district heating. Most of my family has no idea what district heating is, and they have no idea whether or not their home is connected to a district heating network, and they couldn't care less either. I mean, they're absolutely, and whenever I remind them that this is what I do for business, they're like, yeah, that's nice, right? So there's absolutely no care whatsoever. People only care about about things like this when they break down. So my challenge, I guess, around those numbers, which was from the ETI the analysis that was done, where I think it's crucial that we have knowledge of heat networks is around that client base in order to and of course within the heat network industry itself, but clients who are scoping out heat networks. So this is within the property sectors and within public sector. Those people who are scoping out the need for heat and energy efficiency measures in the homes that they are affiliated with, whether they're existing or new build, that's where we need the knowledge of the heat network sector. In the general population, I would challenge that is even a requirement. It'd be nice if students were aware of it, but I think that might be better addressed through the courses that Phil was mentioning, and you yourself as well, Gareth. But for the wider populace, I really don't think that there is a need for them to understand what heat networks are.
One thing I do think is there is an increase. I think we are increasing knowledge and experience in the industry. I think we're doing it rapidly. I think CP1 2020 is a good illustration of that. I do think, though, we tend to be a little bit siloed and people keep things to their chest. I think we need to be far more collaborative as an industry, far more about sharing best practice, because there is no way we're going to hit those targets if we don't. And I think it's actually, I think the more we can share will actually help grow the overall industry. So I think we are actually growing, but I think we need to be doing more on that front.
Yeah, and I think just to say on that, I think I totally agree, but I think it's really important, I think, when you're looking especially at heat across to energy efficiency, to think about the different occupancy tenures and what you'll be able to do with different ones. I think if we're looking, say, owner occupied and using, as Noah was saying, trigger points in terms of, I guess, the sale of a property, for example, perhaps in future conditions associated with your mortgages, which is what we're seeing in energy efficiency. I think that's the only part of the market where actually raising that awareness is really, really important. I think sort of private sector social housing, I think you're exactly right, but I think that bit we still need to crack a little bit.
But again, coming back to trumpeting information out there, another question we've got coming through, question from Nigel Lane, is there a good practice guide for a heat supply agreement for the customer? And who wants to take this? Because I'm aware there is a suite of legal documents which has been paid for by government. There isn't awareness. Shivali, do you want to mention on that, or Caroline?
I can quickly mention, and then Caroline can go into details as well as a user. There are lots of, so Triple Point are our delivery partner with HNIP, and there's a lot of investment being done in standardization on contracts and how these can be used. That there's legal views on this one, so please visit the website. I can actually add some of them on the chat. Try to look at it, and yes, you're right, Gareth, there is a lot of information in there, but yes, it needs to be trolled down into consumers and customers.
Another one, we're a housing association will be delivering a number of heat networks in the coming years that will be handed over and operated and maintained by our asset management colleagues. What do you suggest we do now to prepare our internal teams and manage risk associated with the skills gap for operation and maintenance of these heat networks? Anyone want to deal with this, or? Noah? Yep, you're on mute.
Yeah, so I think, it's definitely a big challenge with housing associations, especially with the need to decarbonise their portfolio. I think our approach as Vattenfall is to work with a sort of partnership approach. So being able to understand what the needs are, because there may be a need for a lot of work with energy efficiency and upgrading the system. And so, I think the first thing is understanding what needs to happen there and understanding how that can work, whether it's a case of having people who are more specialists in the heat networks to work with that system, or whether that's building the capacity in-house. So one of our approaches is to say we don't have a kind of a model which says this is how you do it. I think we'd have to have that conversation to understand, okay, where are you in your journey? Where is your starting point really? And then take it from there, because that really ties into working to build supply chain. We're very happy to invest in supply chain, and we work with contractors as an approach to delivering heat networks. So I think having that conversation is where we'd normally start on these things.
If I can just on that, I'll take, we work with a lot of different with a lot of different housing associations around this. I think the thing I would do is a group together internally. So you see people like Guinness Partnership have done really well with this, where I would pull together the disparate parts of the business and make sure you sit down. You actually should set this up as an initiative around heat networks. You should consider right from day one, how do we want to procure heat networks? Look at CP1, which are the pieces how are we going to implement it? Look at our processes and build that through, and then actually be very, very clear on making sure that you get your specification written correctly that's going through, and that you have the right checks as you go through the process. And really importantly, I would treat your asset management team as being client internally and get them involved. And this is where we see this disconnect quite often. We have the development side and the asset management side who work independently, and the asset management side should be there from day one as part of that, setting the specification and make sure that you have your monthly meetings where you sit down and review it as a team. Sorry, Tanya.
Yeah, well, just to echo, I guess one of your key points there, Gareth, around the CP1, there will be, the CIBSE will be hosting the new courses around CP1 2020, I've been told, starting this year. I'm looking forward to it, but that might be a good starting point, especially with the checklists that Gareth was referencing, Phil was referencing to in his presentation earlier, because personally, I like having checklists. That would be maybe the economist / me, or the one that got attracted to working in an engineering consultancy in the first place, having a nice long checklist, so that you're sure that you covered everything. So not the negative connotation of it being a checklist exercise, but it's nice that it gives you a comprehensive overview of what kind of key risks you should be looking at, because I know from an asset management point of view, what you're really concerned about are those kind of long-term risks in terms of operation maintenance, breaking down, reliance, etc. And having that initial list to know what you're looking for, know what you should be asking about. To me, that gives greater certainty of mind. Sorry, my English is failing me now. I'm hungry.
On that, I think we'll sort of wrap up now. There were quite a few questions we had back on domestic hot water and temperatures. I'm not going to do a spoiler. We have a presentation on that by Andrew McKay, and I'm joining him this afternoon. So please make sure you go along, so you'll get your answers on 50 degrees and implications around that to anyone's asked questions. Just one final question from Stephen Edwards. The GLA are pushing back on ambient loop systems, which do indicate the high levels of carbon reduction on scheme designs because of their commitment. To low to heat networks. Can low temperature ambient loop systems ever be having a role in integrating with and contributing to heat networks? And Phil, I think you're going to leap straight in on this one.
Yes, is the answer. Absolutely. And we're doing it. And can I just say, the system we're working on right now is actually all on existing buildings, producing 75 flow to meet the needs of those existing buildings. So it's not a new build thing. I think it's the way forward. And we're seeing huge carbon savings. I mean, unimaginable carbon savings for a heat network. And as I say, the more prosuming you do, the better. It's all about that sharing of heat and cool.
Can I think there's a little bit of a misnomer as well when people talk about ambient loop and different. I think where we're talking about it and when we see sort of the fifth generation that Phil's really talking about generally, we're talking about large scale ambient loop systems where you then get your endpoint, often the buildings themselves, and this is where the difference is, and you get a number of people within the sector. You can have large scale heat pumps in the basement where you're then actually distributing at a step up temperature within the building itself. And I think the pushback from GLA isn't on the ambient system per se, it's actually integrating, but it is on actually distributing through and having individual pumps in every home, where I think that push comes from. And you can have fifth generation and fourth generation. This is where we'll have the discussions and arguments, Phil. I actually think it was a mistake to say fifth generation because it implies that it's a step on from fourth generation. I think fourth generation and fifth generation work very, very well together in systems together. And if you look around the world, that's actually how it's generally applied, where it's been applied.
Well, we're doing something new.
Shivali.
Really good comment on that one, Gareth. I'm mindful of time. I agree with you on it's a compatibility question more than any other pushback. I would say it's important that, again, coming back to the whole thing of awareness and education, how do we ensure that it is quite clear in the market? And this is this point which Noah mentioned previously. It's from the industry as well. How easy is it to actually connect these two from 4G, 5G? One is, we say, from our technical CP1 guidance, and yes, Phil, Martin, and others have put together it, but it's also the practical use cases or any practical work or projects which have been done, and more PR on that one. And let's make it more flashy for more awareness on this. So I think evidence is going to play a big part in bringing the change as well.
Great. I think we have well and truly run over time. Thank you for your patience, everyone, on the course. Thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. Big challenge ahead, exciting challenge ahead. For people who have posted questions which we didn't get to, we will publish and respond. And again, I just want to note that this afternoon we have 2 additional sessions. So at 12 o'clock, so in half an hour, we'll be back here again. We've got a technical showcase. So we've got from 12 to 2:45, we're going through a whole series of really interesting talks, which will respond to the domestic hot water questions that are posted up. And then 3:15 to 5:15 this afternoon, we've got a session on how to decarbonize heat networks. And again, we've got a great bunch of external speakers for all of that. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for your time today, and look forward to catching up soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.